Okay, hello everybody. My name is Matt Mawer from Coventry University. My colleague Erica Bowen unfortunately is quite unwell, so she won't be joining us this afternoon, so I'm afraid you'll have to make do with me, and hopefully I'll live up to the billing. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of a project we've been doing funded by the European Union called CARVA, and it's all about violence in teenagers' relationships and ways we can prevent violence in teenagers' relationships, ways we can reduce the risk, ways we can intervene to make those relationships safer. And we've been doing this across 4 countries, the United Kingdom, so England primarily, Sweden, Belgium, and Germany. And I'm going to try and condense 2 years of project work into about 15 minutes, so I'm going to give you the highlights of what the project's been like, because it's been a multi-phase project, and hopefully that'll give you some inspiration to maybe go away and have a look at our website, which will be up at the end. So, before we go any further, what is dating violence? So I mentioned violence in teenagers' relationships. There are multiple words for teenagers, adolescents. I heard puberty, so pubescence. I'm going to use the word adolescents. Hopefully it translates reasonably well into the different languages in the audience, but I mean roughly people 12 to 16 years old. Okay? So dating violence is all about the kinds of relationships that these people get into and the ways that they can become abusive. And this has been a big topic for analysis and policy making for adults. We've heard of domestic violence, and there are huge networks of people involved in trying to reduce and prevent domestic violence for adults. But only in the last few years, maybe 10 years, have we started focusing on how adolescents involved in relationships can suffer from abuse and become perpetrators of abuse as well. So, dating violence roughly divided into 3 or 4 categories. This comes from Saltzman. The references for all of this and then the presentation we'll put onto the website so you can have a look at it if you like. Saltzman divides violence into physical violence, so you can imagine that's punching, kicking people, that kind of thing, into psychological violence. And psychological violence is a little bit more difficult to define, but it centers around withholding from people resources that they need to live, so this could be money, food, all sorts of things. Tormenting people with embarrassing remarks or sending pictures of them around or something like this that they're not wanting to be made public. I'm sure you can use your imagination a little bit there. Anything along those lines that could be psychologically damaging to someone. Also threats of doing these things. And then finally, sexual violence, which I don't think really needs much of an analysis. And what we know from research on the prevalence of domestic violence in adults, and also our initial research in looking at domestic violence with adolescents, is that this is cyclical. So not only is domestic violence itself cyclical, and it comes in multiple phases, but also kids who are in their 12 to 16 phase, adolescents, tend to experiment with behaviors which can become ingrained and later in early 20s and then for the rest of the life can become tendencies towards abuse in relationships. This cyclical process, this cycle of abuse, if you like, is something which is really vicious and it's difficult to cut out. We're not quite sure whether or not those behaviors are simply experimental, adolescents experiment with things, or whether there's something else going on. This is a kind of a hole in the research. Maybe somebody will fill me in if you know something about that. But we do know that there is a cycle. So, this CARVA project was all about producing a games-based intervention to try and tackle this cycle, to try and stop violence in adolescent relationships before it starts, preferably, but if they're in abusive relationships, then to try and reduce the risk, to get people to identify that they're in abusive relationships and take steps to get out of them or to make them not abusive. Why a game? Well, there's a set of interventions already available for this, programs which tend to be run in schools or youth groups or something like that, but they're mostly done in groups. Now, I can't speak to all of the countries which you're representing here, but certainly in the United Kingdom, relationships education in school is really patchy. It's really variable, whether it's done at length, whether it's done just a few sessions per year, whether it's done at all. It's not part of our national curriculum. So it's quite difficult to get buy-in to do large group interventions. There's also some question out of the published research literature on this, whether group interventions can actually be negative in some cases. There's some evidence that sometimes they make the problem worse, and I can go into that in a little detail if anybody's interested later. So, dating violence, we were thinking we need to produce some kind of intervention which can be used on an individual basis, preferably, something which can be used in schools, where there are safeguarding procedures in place. If somebody puts their hand up and says, hey, look, I'm in an abusive relationship, what do I do? And also something where teachers can take a different role. Because again, maybe different in countries, but certainly in the UK, there's some real resistance or anxiety over getting involved in adolescents' relationships as a teacher. There's a lack of training, all sorts of things are going on. There are some serious dynamics there. So, that's what dating violence is all about. What's our project all about? Where am I pointing this? Here? Okay, so, Carver project, 4 phases. The first one was an international review of literature. The second one, we did some qualitative research. We used that to inform the development of a game, which I'll talk to you a little bit about. And our current phase is implementation and evaluation. So, international review stuff. We were looking at the prevalence, the risk factors, and the current interventions for dating violence for adolescents. This is just the European summary of findings. We actually looked across Europe and North America, but I've kind of cut the North American stuff out for this. And you can see that, first of all, the ranges are really wild because of the different ways that this is reported. So there's kind of no standardized way of reporting whether or not somebody's been involved in an abusive relationship or not, which gives you these really wild ranges of like 17 to 72% of girls have been involved in psychological abuse. Obviously, this is a problem with the kind of data we have available to us. But if you take an average of what's there, then you can see that this is quite a substantial problem. Even taking something like physical violence for girls alone, you can say that 1 in 5 girls who are in relationships and are adolescents are likely to have been involved in physical violence or been a victim of physical violence at some point. That's a pretty stark figure when you consider the populations of the countries that were involved in the project, so Germany, England, Sweden, Belgium, and then just of Europe more generally. And some of these figures go really, really high. So psychological violence up to 72%. 72% of girls being a victim of psychological violence, as defined by these ACT scales of have you ever been, etc., etc. Has somebody ever done this to you? So we had a look at that. That's the kind of prevalence around Europe. So we decided this is a serious problem. We also had a look at the kind of intervention programs which were available. And the problem with the intervention programs is they're all based here in North America. Now, really we didn't know whether this was a bad thing or not. It's just one of those quirks of the literature. All intervention programs we found were reported in North America. But we didn't know whether or not they were going to be culturally specific to North America, or whether or not they could inform our game design for European adolescents. So we needed another stage. So that's what we did next. We conducted a qualitative project, running focus groups with adolescents in all 4 of the partner countries. We did about 86 adolescents took part in total. And we were looking at what their attitudes towards violence, what their attitudes towards relationships were, what they thought abusive relationships looked like. So we could decide whether or not those interventions that were going on in North America would also be suitable for Europe. And here is a very scary looking theme map of what we came up with. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You'll probably be happy to know. Just a few key points. So the main things we found were that gender matters a lot. First of all, it matters to do with how people perceive relationships, but it also mattered for when violence was considered to be acceptable. So there was a general blanket statement of violence in relationships is unacceptable. Almost everybody says that. You'd kind of expect them to. But then they quickly came up with a list of qualifications. But you can be violent if somebody's cheated on you. You can be violent if somebody's really gotten on your nerves that day. Girls being violent is less severe than boys being violent, etc., etc. You can see the list builds up. So violence was considered generally unacceptable, but depending on who was committing it and depending on what the circumstances were, it was kind of okay sometimes. So this was a big problem for us. So we thought there are lots of myths or lots of challenging beliefs about dating and about violence, things we'd quite like to stamp out. That's probably the wrong word for a talk about violence, to cut out. Okay? So those were a couple of the main findings. We also found that the media was very, very influential in the way people thought about what a relationship looked like and what a healthy relationship and an abusive relationship looked like. This notion of television as educator, and it's not even necessarily specific programs about violence. It's things like the news, things like soap operas. You know, in the UK it's things like EastEnders. I don't know, I'm sure you have lots of soap operas in different countries, but they often have violent relationships in them, and that's where these kids was learning about what an abusive relationship actually looked like. So there were a lot of stereotypes, particularly the kinds which are portrayed by soap operas and the media. The good news, though, was that this all mirrored quite well the findings from the United States, particularly in North America generally. So that gave us some good news. When we were designing our game and putting it together, we could say, well, actually, attitudes are pretty similar, so we can take what's already been written, the different intervention programs, and we can use those as the basis of our game. Anyway, yes, we can use those as the basis of our game. And we needed to think about what this had told us to write our game, so we thought, well, the key points are we need to be able to demystify these ideas about when violence is acceptable, to promote an idea that it's not acceptable pretty much ever, rather than sometimes it's okay. We needed to help people to help their friends, because we knew from the research, and this is the box over on the right here, that when adolescents needed help, they didn't go to teachers, they didn't go to social workers, they went to their friends and they went to peers. So we needed to help people to help their peers. So that's kind of where we were going with the game as well. So we decided we'd develop our game around those principles. And we needed something which we could use in schools. We needed it to be something which was relatively easy to roll out. So we went for a Flash-based game, something we could do online. And that spawned Green Acres High. I'm not going to give you a live demo for time's sake, but you can, again, talk to me afterwards if you want to. Green Acres High is a game where the player takes the part of a school mentor or a school representative, and they have to go through the school year helping out their friends who are in various kinds of abusive and non-abusive relationships. We took those existing interventions, which were split into chapters, and we built them into our game. So we have 5 chapters, and they go from understanding and identifying what healthy relationships look like, and then you get to kind of the other end and you're looking at support seeking and finding help. And the idea is you play the chapters sequentially, it kind of scaffolds learning, and you build that knowledge up, and it gives you the skills to identify healthy relationships and to take action. And that was kind of important to us. We wanted something that was going to not just give people information, but give them an idea of what they could do if there was a problem. So we took this from a couple of intervention programs like Safe Dates in the United States and also from Expect Respect in the UK. There are quite a few intervention programs around. Most of them are group-based, and you get kind of an enormous book sent to you through the post, which you then use in class as a teacher over maybe 5 or 10 weeks. Ours is over 5 weeks, although one of the things we've discovered running the project is even getting people to engage for 5 weeks with this, in the UK at least, has been really, really tricky, because having 5 one-hour slots in your school timetable to put a game like this into practice has proved almost impossible. You know, it's kind of end-of-year stuff where people are like, what are we going to do? Shall we watch a video? Oh, I know, we'll do a project about dating violence in class. And that's kind of the audience we've been trying to capture when they've got a little bit of space in the timetable. It's very, very busy, the school timetable, we've discovered, more so than we anticipated. So, you go through the game as your character. The character's not named, it's designed to be you or somebody other than you. You get to kind of envision that for yourself. We were trying to avoid putting an identity onto the character, so you could, if you wanted to, project it as yourself. I'm the mentor, I'm helping my friends out in school. Or for a little bit of safety, maybe a bit of additional comfort, the security of an additional layer, you could say, I'm playing someone else who is helping out their friends in school. So maybe a little bit of kind of psychological trickery there. And this is split into 2 kinds of tasks. So you maneuver your way through the game and you're asked to complete 2 kinds of tasks. The first kind are really abstract, and they're things like identify whether or not these relationship characteristics are good or bad, which is, we would hope, pretty easy. If somebody starts saying, yes, it's very good to be uncaring and to be violent to your partner, then we'd probably start getting a bit worried, and your teacher in class could step in and say, I think you've put that in the wrong place. You probably mean that's a good thing in relationships. But it should be fairly simple. But the idea is to get people to identify general principles of what a relationship should look like. And we've had to simplify that down a little bit. So all relationships are different, but we've had to simplify it down to really fairly obvious things like loving is good, hating each other is bad, and so forth. The other part of the game is all about situational role plays. And this was where we were trying to get people to put those skills and that understanding of general principles into practice. And each of these is a kind of animated vignette, a kind of animated scenario where a friend comes to you and says, look, something happened to me last night. I'm kind of worried about my relationship. Can you give me some help? And you say, yes, of course I can, because you're a mentor. And this little video plays and you watch. So here we've got Sebastian and Maria gone out for coffee. Maria starts talking to someone in the queue. If the video was playing, then Sebastian would get very cross because he's quite a jealous type and end up dragging her out of the shop by the arm. And you have to make assessments of these situations as the player. You decide whether or not this is safe or risky behavior. You decide whether or not it's inherently good or bad in a relationship. And then as the game progresses and you hopefully gain the skills from learning about the principles, you can start saying, well, what could you have done differently? What help can you seek in order to try and stop this from happening again? So that's really all the game does. It's split into those 2 types of tasks. There are 5 chapters, so there are quite a lot of tasks. But that's what we try to do. And then each task is oriented to the chapter, so some of them are about help seeking, some of them are about identifying abusive dynamics in relationships, and so forth. So, where are we now? Well, we've built the game, finally. It took a little bit of time, there were a few delays in the building process, and now we're implementing it. So, there are 4 countries putting this into practice, which I've coloured in very carefully after I got my map out to make sure I wasn't going to make an embarrassing faux pas and colour in Norway or something when I meant Sweden. But this is where we're piloting it. Sweden and Belgium are already underway. They've got it in schools, and they're running it in classes, taking pre-intervention psychological data over attitudes towards violence, knowledge about dating violence, and we're also looking at subgroups. So if some people are very hyperactive, or if some people are very reflective learning styles, this kind of thing. Are they going to benefit more or less from the game? We're not quite sure whether or not there'll be anything in that. We've got no hypothesis about it, but we're taking that data because at the end we'll be able to analyse when the post-test data comes in whether or not any specific groups of people seem to have benefited more or less from this game. Assuming there's any change at all, which is hopefully going to be the outcome of the project, that it does make a difference. So, a little bit of photography for you. At the bottom here in Belgium, kids on computers using this game in class. At the top in Sweden. In the UK, we're also starting next week, and I think Germany is starting the week afterwards. So it's starting to roll into the implementation phase now. The evaluation will hopefully be done by Christmas, and then we'll be analysing all of the data, lots and lots of yummy statistical data. Yes, I know, I'm very nerdy. So that is the whirlwind tour of the Carver project. It's all about changing adolescents' attitudes towards violence in relationships. 4 countries, currently being implemented. Maybe we'll get back to you when the data's come in, and hopefully it'll make a big difference to the way those adolescents' relationships actually play out and try and reduce that cycle of abuse. Here are our partner logos. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have about the project. There's a hand waving. Go ahead.
Could you remind us, and what age groups is this targeted for?
12 to 16. So we centered it on 12 to 16-year-olds, partly because of the school curriculum, but also this is how we've defined adolescence. And generally that's how it's defined in all of the research literature as well. So 12 to 16 it's centered on.
About how sort of deep are the personalities that go into the game, because I can sort of imagine that this particular age group may look at the game and find that if the personalities are too shallow, they can't really take it very seriously, and the message may just go past them. So about how deep are these personalities?
I'm not sure how to give you a measure of how deep they are. I can tell you that predominantly the characters in the game are just characterized by their relationships. There's not a lot of backdrop to the game. You don't learn a great deal about the school. You don't learn a great deal about the individual people and what they like and don't like. There is a description of the characters that you read through at the start, but it's fairly limited. And we've had some discussion early on when we started the project, and every time we've gone to one of our research sites to say, do you want to use this game in class? We've had a different reaction from the teachers, and they've always been along those lines. Do you have a character who represents this group? Do you have a character who will be resonant with this kind of audience? So there are no characters who are physically disabled, for instance, in the game, so nobody on crutches or in a wheelchair or anything like that. That was brought up by one set of teachers. We've had questions about ethnicity, same-sex relationships, this kind of thing. A lot of it has been managing, first of all, budgets, which is kind of standard for this, but also about what different countries, the ethics of schools will allow us to actually put into place. So same-sex relationships is quite a good example of that. In some countries that's fine. In others it's a little bit more problematic to have that in a game to use in schools. So I don't know if that answers your question so much, how deep they are, but a little bit deep but not too deep, I think is probably the answer to that. Was there another...
My question is about the fun factor. You're distributing, or you want to distribute your game through schools, through the school curriculum. But this is a theme that's not so popular. So parents, it's difficult for parents to teach them, to the adolescents. I think the teachers as well will have some problems with it.
Yes.
So my question is, how will you make it more attractive? I saw the beautiful game, but what is the fun factor of it? And will they play it or do it also if they're not going to school, just to have more impact in the prevention?
Okay, let me take the second part of that question first. At the moment, it's not designed to be used outside of schools because we have safeguarding responsibilities in the project. We need to make sure that when adolescents use the game, it's in a safe setting where we can guarantee they won't be hurt. And our concern was that it's kind of sad to say, but not every home is a safe place. So if you're at home playing through this game on a computer and you're in an abusive family or you've got an abusive partner looking over your shoulder or something like that, we were really worried that this was going to cause a problem for them, and we didn't want that to happen. So we've said this can be used at the moment anywhere that has appropriate safeguarding procedures, so schools, youth groups, that kind of thing. Anywhere where we know that if there's a kid in the class who says, look, I'm in an abusive relationship, what do I do? There's some kind of procedure in place to actually help them, and also that they're not going to make abuse worse by taking part in this. The first part of your question was the fun factor. That's not something that I can really speak to. I'm not a games designer by trade. I'm a sort of psychologist, educationalist. What we hope is that this will be, first of all, more fun than what they get at the moment, which is basically nothing. But if they do get something, then it's probably a talk from a teacher in class and sometimes a group-based discussion. So what we hope is that, first of all, by moving it to an individual level and engaging with the game, they'll have a more sustained engagement with the topic. And we hope that just playing the media version rather than sitting and listening to someone talk about it will be more fun. This is probably going to be quite controversial in a conference about games, but I'm not that bothered about whether or not it's really fun. I'm more bothered about whether or not it effectively gets across the message. And I know those are very closely related, but given the provision that we have at the moment, the primary emphasis has kind of been on how on earth do we create an intervention which is going to engage people with it. And we're hoping that in the feedback that we get from the adolescents who play it, they're going to go, this bit was rubbish, this bit was rubbish, this bit was rubbish, and then we'll change it. So it's a bit more engaging for the next group, because we're in that kind of pilot phase.
I was wondering, and both from a, let's say, production perspective and at the research perspective, since it's a study that involved 4 different countries, so how was your approach, especially in the early design stages, to cultural differences, and on the flip side of that, future scalability of the game product in case you want to incorporate more countries?
Yeah, cultural difference is a really good example of that. The first set of characters, and they're all the way back, so I can't get there, I don't think, very easily with Prezi, but the first set of characters that we had, we designed in Coventry in England, took them to a project meeting in Sweden, I think it was, or Germany, one of the two, and put them up on a presentation screen like this, and all of the project partners fell about laughing because they were all in school uniforms, which only the UK seems to have, pretty much. So, yeah, we've had some of those issues. Names is another really good example of it. Some of the names we've been trying to choose quite carefully, so we've got things like Sebastian and Maria and names which will go across countries reasonably well. In terms of scalability, we've been thinking primarily in terms of the countries that we have at the moment, with the idea that if there is a future development of the project anyway, presumably they'll have funding to develop the game further as well. So we've not really thought about how we'd apply this in other countries, and there's a real lack of evidence actually in Europe in general as to what attitudes are towards, attitudes towards dating violence particularly. So if you take, for instance, the studies that I showed earlier on, they're primarily from the Netherlands, the UK, a little bit from Germany, none from France, which is very strange, huge country, Spain, Italy, some from Italy, but very little data. And then if you get further east, no data at all. So there's a real problem around kind of transparency of data as well, transparency of what different cultures and different cultural attitudes towards this topic will be. So in answer to your question, don't really know, probably for the next project to expand on for that. But yeah, we've had a few interesting encounters.
Take one more question.
One more? Here?
I can speak loudly. What kind of data are you getting back from the game?
We will have, across the 4 countries, psychometrics for, I think it's the strengths and weaknesses scale, so that's looking at primarily looking at different subgroups in this case, I think. So strengths and weaknesses scale, we have a knowledge metric, which is pretty basic, to be honest. It's one of the things that fell foul of the development process a little bit, but we'll have a knowledge metric. We have an attitudinal metric towards whether or not people think that it's okay for different genders to involve themselves in violence in different circumstances. So kind of following on from what I said about the literature. So we'll have all of that pre-test, so pre-intervention, all of that post-test, and then we're also running qualitative focus groups with the adolescents that are involved in the different countries. And I think, hopefully, we're going to interview the teachers as well, because they're the kind of the silent partner in what I've presented. We're going to speak to them about what it was like to use the data in class. Probably the big frustration has been that we don't have now a period to take long-term evaluation data because of the delays in the development process. So what we'll be looking to do is find a way to take that long-term evaluation data, because this is, even if there's a post-test change in attitudes towards violence in relationships, we want to make sure, or we want to understand whether or not that continues across 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, etc. There's not much point in making a change for 1 week and then everything returns to the status quo.
I was thinking, just my initial gut reaction was that a lot of adolescents, they know what they should answer, but they don't maybe act like it later. I think you'll have a problem maybe with how accurate the data is.
Yeah, sure, with social desirability stuff. Well, our hope is that because you play the game individually as well, that will be less of a factor than it will be in group-based interventions. But again, hopefully that'll come out in the final evaluation and we'll be able to make a statement either way as to whether or not we think there's a big social desirability problem or not. I think that was my one, so thank you very much.